Well, I'm going to say let's go ahead and get started. Um, some people are getting prompted to hurry along here. Keith Graber Miller, I think, is familiar to many of us. He has taught at Goshen College for how many years, Keith? Since 1987. So you can do the math. And one of the things that he's taught at Goshen College is a course on human sexuality, and he's team taught that course with several people over the years, including some CMCers. It began with Willard Crable some years ago, and I think he's worked with Anne, and now Beth Carnegie Miller. So all three a part of or with ties to College Mennonite Church. It's my privilege to welcome you, Keith, here, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks. It's good to be here with you. And some of you did hear me speak a couple week and a half ago in the Sojourners class, but this will be a bit different than that. I'll start off with a few things that were similar to what I said there. For those of you who need to go to the music concert, you're welcome to get up and go. We won't be offended by that. And so please feel free to do that. I have been working with the human sexuality class for a long time. My sort of standard joke about that is that class began back in 1974. Willard Crable began teaching that back long before it was very safe to speak about sexuality in Mennonite contexts. It was long before Mennonites had ever even had sex, and so it was a dangerous thing to do. But I'm very grateful for the sort of groundbreaking work that he did, and I like to see myself in continuity with what he has done, and it would be interesting to hear him speak tonight. I'm talking about something I don't usually talk about. Usually I do biblical theological perspectives on same-sex sexuality. So what I'm doing tonight is not that. I'm going to say a little bit about some sociological things and then talk a little bit about some biological kinds of things to work more with orientation, those sorts of things. So you're going to get a lot of stuff from Lauren Johns, who's excellent in this area in speaking about the biblical texts and sort of theological understandings of same-sex sexuality. So you're getting a whole bunch of different places where you can hear things. And also, although Becky asked me to speak about the biological basis of sexuality, so some of what I say will be more general about sexuality, but because you're in this process, I assume part of what you want to hear about is some things related to same-sex sexuality and same-sex sexual orientation. So that's sort of the direction that we're going to be going here in just a little bit. There has been a very significant attitudinal shift in the U.S. since the Supreme Court decision in June of 2015 that made same-sex marriage legal in all states. Up just before that spring, there were 36 states that had already accepted it, so it was more than halfway toward acceptance by individual states, and then that legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states. And the tide had begun shifting already by about 2011. You can see here on the chart questions that have been asked by Gallup Poll, and also the Pew Research Center has done a lot of work on this. I just saw another study today that traced this up to 2016. It's almost exactly the same. The figures haven't changed much. But you can see there was a shifting for people who said same-sex marriage or same-sex couple should be recognized as valid by law. That shift began happening in about 2011, where there was a preponderance of people who were on the sort of the accepting side of that, and that has only continued to rise since that time. So that's, I think, interesting to see. That doesn't mean that everybody agrees on this. There is a difference, as you might expect, between millennials, a younger generation born between 1981 and 1995. That's the top line there, with an increasing acceptance of same-sex marriage. And then below that, Gen X, it just goes straight down through the generation. So the silent generation, if you're born between 1923 and 1945, something like that, you would be much less likely to be accepting, on the whole, the same-sex marriage than some other people would. Although I think in a context like this, that's probably different. In the larger U.S. public, it would be different than that. I know, and I go to Assembly Mennonite Church now, and I know in that context, and I know many of you in this context who would have very different views, and the silent generation may be way up there with some of the other folks. But it's important to recognize that. It's also still different in terms of parties. Republicans are by far much less accepting of same-sex marriage than are independents and then Democrats. And I also have some, I won't show you the statistics on what religious groups say. White evangelicals tend to be lesser than most other groups, and then Buddhists are sort of way up there in acceptance, and so you get different kinds of religious groups and denominational groups within Christianity that have pretty different perspectives on this as well. But on the whole, the tide has shifted toward the point where most people, a majority of people in the U.S., are very accepting, embracing of same-sex marriage, which is in line with what the Supreme Court has said. I've often lamented that the church actually wasn't, well, I'm going to talk about my perspective some too, so you might as well hear that some. I wish the church had been ahead of the game on this and had embraced same-sex sexuality and same-sex marriage long before the culture did, because people will now say, oh, the church is just following the culture. And my sense is that that's not really necessarily the case, at least with some churches, and I wish we'd have been ahead of that. What's interesting is that we have been talking about same-sex marriage and same-sex sexuality for so long that people who are under 40 could be forgiven if they thought that was the only kind of sex that you could have, is in a same-sex relationship, because that's about all the church or the culture have been talking about. And what's really interesting, I think, is that people who are under 30 see, and I mentioned this when I was talking with the other group, and I think it gave Naomi and John pause. When I was talking with the Sojourners group, I said, I think that people under 30, it is just totally not an issue for your children and grandchildren, for the students that I see at Goshen College, for a lot of young people in our culture. They don't get it at all. They see no problem. They don't see it as an issue. They don't really even want to talk about it much anymore, about same-sex sexuality or same-sex marriage. And people who commit themselves to loving long-term same-sex relationships, they're kind of quaint now. They're kind of cute. We have a woman who is in a marriage with another woman who's coming to speak to human sexuality tomorrow night. And I talked with her at church on this past Sunday, and she said, yeah, some of the students now think I'm cute, don't they? And I said, yes, they do. They think you're cute and quaint. And she said, I am not cute. So she wants to still be edgy, but that's not necessarily where it's at for a lot of young people. So before we get to some other things, I do want to talk a little bit just in identifying some still developing understandings of sex and gender. Most people know now that you should differentiate sex and gender. Sex has been typically understood to be what's sort of biologically given. Sex is what you were born with, born male or born female. And gender has to do with how that gets constructed into certain kinds of mores about how you're supposed to behave, what you wear, how you behave, how you defer to other people, how you respond in society. So that's gender. And we've understood for quite a while that gender is socially constructed. What's interesting now is that some people are suggesting that sex, your biological sex, is also socially constructed. Christian ethicist Christine Gudorf argues that there are at least 6 biological factors that make up our sex. You have chromosomal sex, sort of different measures of different chromosomes. You have different measures of hormonal sex. Men and women have testosterone and progesterone running through their bodies and other hormones, but they're in different levels. There's sex of the external genitalia. Do you have a vulva or do you have a penis? Sex of the internal reproductive organs. And then gonadal sex, testes or ovaries, and then sex of the brain, which is not sort of how you think about it, but sort of how the brain is wired, and we'll say more about that after a bit. And what some have been arguing is that although maybe many times these 6 biological factors all go together, they don't always all go together. And we don't have a very good way of measuring how you determine if someone is male or female, except when we're born. Typically a nurse or physician sees the baby, sees whether it has a penis or a vulva, and says it's a boy or it's a girl. So we use the one of the 6 measures to determine the sex of the person, the sex of the new baby. And so some people are saying that's not good enough. And so some of what you hear about in sort of trans culture and sort of trans realities, we hear more and more people saying that they were coercively assigned a sex at birth or misidentified by their sex at birth. And so that's another whole dynamic that's going on. And so it's much more complicated and much more messy than it was when I first started teaching human sexuality, and certainly way different than when I was younger and sort of had to negotiate sort of the sexual landscape at that time. So those are just interesting things I think to keep in mind. So one of the interesting diagrams lately that I've been using in class is to talk about the genderbread person. So it's not the gingerbread man, but the genderbread person, where you have at least 4 measures of sort of what a person might be in terms of sex and sexuality. One of those is gender identity, man or woman, or gender queer. Then you have gender expression. Are you more masculine? Are you more feminine? Or are you more androgynous in your behaviors? Your biological sex, are you male or female or intersex? Intersex people actually have components biologically that are from either sex. They might have something that looks like a penis, which is an enlarged clitoris perhaps, and they might have one testy and one ovary or something else. They have some other kind of unusual combination, people who are intersex. Very, very small percentage of the population, but there are a number of people who are intersex. And then sexual orientation. Here you have heterosexual on one end, homosexual on the other end, and bisexual in the middle. You can also add a sort of a continuum for romantic interests, or being hypersexual versus asexual. There are a couple other continua. So you could be a gay person who is female but expresses herself as being more masculine even though she identifies as a woman. So you could kind of move back and forth on these charts. And so some things get very interesting in the way students self-identify sometimes in some of our classes. So again, it's complexifying things a good bit. One of the things I suspect that Becky was hoping, or you were hoping to hear a little bit about, was something about sexual orientation. Is that right? That you were hoping something about sexual orientation? Where does sexual orientation come from? And it is true, in this case, we don't know where heterosexual orientation comes from exactly. So when you're speaking about sexual orientation, we have to keep in mind we're talking in general about orientation and what might have an impact on shaping our orientation. But a question I would have just very quickly for you is, what difference does it make? Do you care, and why do you care? Does it make a difference if we know something about the cause of sexual orientation? Will that influence how you think about the statement that you have that you're sort of trying to determine whether you want to embrace? How would that affect you? It's a real question. Yeah.
Well, the one thing I would think of is the efforts in the past of trying to, cure people
Yeah.
who are not what others think they should be, especially like homosexuals to make them
Right.
heterosexuals, that sort of thing. So if there's a cause, you can maybe fix it.
Yeah. If there's a cause, you might be able to fix it. Okay. I'll say a little bit about that later if there's time. Okay. If there's a cause, then a person has no choice. They're not just making a sort of a choice that's sort of over against other things or something. This is simply how they are. So, and I assume that that's part of what people are thinking about when they think about sexual orientation, why it matters to some people. It is true that in general, people in the U.S. think that if you can determine sexual orientation is somehow genetic or biological, that they may be more inclined, at least this is true in the past, they may be more inclined to support gay and lesbian civil rights than those who think it's determined by environmental conditions, or those who think that it's chosen, or those who think that it's socially constructed. Social construction is not something that's easily changed either. I mean, think about how you were socially constructed to behave in certain ways, not necessarily sexual ways. You can't very easily go back and change those ways. I mean, social construction is significant, and it shapes how we are, how we respond now. One of the things we should talk about, too, is the differentiating between erotic orientation and sexual practice and self-definition. Erotic orientation, sexual practice, and self-definition. Sometimes people really resist having these identified, especially people who are part of the queer community. But I think sometimes they are still useful to talk about. Orientation means sort of who you are interested in, who you are attracted to. Sexual practice means, of course, how you behave sexually, who you might sexually interact with. And then your self-definition is whether you identify as of that orientation. And so we know that, for instance, there are people who aren't oriented toward people of the same sex who engage sexually with people of the same sex. There are people who are in prison, for instance, and don't have access to other people of another sex. And there are people who are at all girls schools or all boys schools who interact sexually with people of the same sex because they don't have access to other people on a regular basis. We also know that there are people who might have an orientation who don't do any practicing at all, who don't engage sexually with anyone, or who choose to practice with people who are of the other sex. And then we know that there are a lot more people who have some form of sexual orientation toward people of the same sex or bisexual orientation, and people who practice sexual behaviors that are same-sex or both sexes, who don't identify in any way as being a person who is gay or lesbian. Those figures are radically different, and if there's time, again, I'll show you some of the statistics on that. So that's important, I think, to keep in mind as we get going. Another variable is, and this is from the Klein Bisexual Grid, is to think about a variety of different measures, and then our past behaviors, ideals, our present, and where we would look toward the future. What would we really like? I had a bisexually oriented student who had related, a male, who related mostly to men over the course of his high school and college and post-college years, but whose real desire was to settle down with a woman and have children and so have a family and to appear within sort of the mainstream of society. And that's exactly what he did, how he proceeded through his life. He married a heterosexual woman who knew that he was bisexual and related mostly to men, but who was okay with that, and he settled into a heterosexual, monogamous marriage now, and they have moved through that marriage quite happily and have children, so there are those kinds of realities too. So, yeah. In terms of when we began talking about same-sex sexual orientation, it's a relatively new concept. We have always known that people related in ways with people of the same sex. We've always known that, or people of both sexes, or all sexes. We've known that that's happened, but the term homosexual was coined in 1869. It was coined in German, actually, originally, by an Austrian physician who said that male or female individuals who from birth are erotically oriented toward the same sex. It first appears in English in 1892, and it first appears in English Bible in 1946. That may surprise you because you thought it was there all along, but other terms were used beforehand, things like pervert and things like, there were other language that we used for men who had sex with men or molesters or other kinds of language that got used. So it wasn't until 1946 that the word homosexual first appears in the Bible. By the 1990s, the word went back out of the Bible. So there aren't very many new translations that use that term any longer. King James Version doesn't use it at all. So it's a term that lasted about 50 years in the biblical text, and now it's out again, because it's much more complex than just using that language. The terms that get used, and I'm sure that Lauren has talked about this, or he will talk about malakoi and asenokoitai, the two terms that sometimes get translated as homosexual in those versions of the Bible that have that. Some people knew about, Plato knew, Dante knew, others knew about same-sex orientation earlier on, but their views were not the mainstream views at all. Dante thought in the Middle Ages that about half the population was basically oriented toward the same sex, or had some strong orientation toward the same sex. So no one else believed him, very few people believed him, so that was very much a minority view of the time. It's fairly new, and certainly in the biblical text, there's no evidence that there was any sense at all of same-sex orientation. Same-sex practices, yes, we get that. Same-sex orientation, no. It's all unnatural. If you're relating to someone of the same sex, that's an unnatural kind of behavior in the biblical text. So some models of sexual orientation that I'll run through very quickly here. This one is totally bogus and is accepted as totally bogus, but it didn't become bogus until after it had abused a lot of parents throughout the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I remember going to the Mennonite Convention in Bethlehem in 1983 and hearing a mother speak about how she had taken the burden upon herself because she had a son who was gay, sort of overbearing, dominating mothers and sort of angry, violent fathers created lesbian daughters and so on. Anyway, so there are a lot of people who had those kinds of impressions, and that actually was a fairly dominant kind of understanding for a period of time. It's totally bogus. It comes out of the Oedipal and Electra complex as Freud talks about it. Freud says we all start off being bisexual. This gets screwed up then by the type of parent that's there, and then because of that, then you create someone who's oriented toward the other sex. They love the same-sex parent, and they are attracted to the other sex. No, they love the, yeah, whatever, you know what I mean. I think you know what I mean. So, but it's not true. So, two other models that make some sense. One is Alfred Kinsey. Alfred Kinsey's research at the Indiana University, there's now the Kinsey Institute there that works with sexuality research. Kinsey said he'd seen so many people, too many people, who he thought were somewhere on a continuum. It wasn't like you had just gay people and straight people. There's something else going on here. And so we're all on some kind of a continuum. Now this is old stuff now, from way back in the 1950s. And so most people, I think, kind of accept this notion now. Kinsey said not that many people are actually at a 6, where they are straight up oriented toward people of the same sex. And not that many of us are at 0, straight up heterosexual. Most of us, he said, are kind of between like 1 and 2. We're kind of between 1 and 2. Most of the population would be between 1 and 2. When you get to 3, that's kind of that bisexual location, and then you'd have a smaller percentage of the population that would be somewhere on the 3 to 6, in the 3 to 6 range. So that's what Kinsey had speculated at the time. Now, one of the things that got critiqued about that was that it was too suggestive that if you were more gay-oriented, then you would be less straight-oriented. And so the next model, this third model by Storms, came into play in the late 70s, early 80s, to say you could be high homoerotic and high heteroerotic. You could have both things going on and be high in both of them. So it just adds another dimension. So you could be sort of high homoerotic, but sort of be up here somewhere in the other grid. So those are other sort of models for thinking about sexual orientation. The one then that we're going to talk about a little bit more here now is thinking about some kind of genetic or some kind of biological factor that contributes toward sexual orientation. This Newsweek cover, I remember very, very well because this is a 6-month-old in the cover, and our oldest son was 2 months old when this came out. So we were very conscious about this. We were living in Atlanta. I remember the Newsweek coming to our door and thinking, And so we had talked about that already in our home, and we were perfectly at peace if our child was gay. It turns out, apparently, he wasn't. But we were perfectly okay if he was, and I remember we talked at the time. We said we didn't want him to be a particular form of political sort of orientation, but we didn't mind about his sexual orientation at the time. So there have been a variety of recent hormonal and genetic and brain anatomy studies that have suggested pretty clear biological links to sexual orientation. We don't have a gay gene, and probably never will have a gay gene. It might be better because some people might want to eliminate the gay gene. And so, but we don't have a gay gene, but we have a lot of things that contribute toward and are correlated with sexual orientation. And some of these you would have heard about before in some context, perhaps. Some of them may be new to you. So some of the suggestions that have come up more recently, something strange happened to my slides here when I said those. That's a very odd framing of that. Anyway, these hormones we know, I should probably look at my notes sometime. Let me see here. Hormones play a role in regulating the gender-specific sexual behaviors of non-human animals. There are certain brain structures that are defeminized by male hormones that are produced in the fetal testes. These developmental mechanisms might play a role in establishing the early foundations of sexual orientation. One of those in particular is congenital adrenal hyperplasia, CAH, which correlates with a greater likelihood of being bisexual or same-sex oriented, particularly with females, with baby girls. There are also anatomical differences in the hypothalamus between gay men and heterosexual men and women. There's a particular cluster of cells at the back of the hypothalamus that in gay men is much more like the hypothalamus, that particular cluster of cells in women than it is in heterosexual men. So another sort of link that's been sort of consistently identified. MRIs and brain scans have suggested men and women have somewhat different brains in the sort of the right and left hemisphere of the brain. For men, there's a lot of symmetry. For women, there's a lot of symmetry. And for for men, the right side of the right hemisphere is typically larger than the left hemisphere of the brain. And so one way you can see this, it's charted out here, it may be a little bit difficult to see. That's heterosexual men, heterosexual women, homosexual men, homosexual women. This is one chart that sort of identifies, and what they say is, again, that gay men tend to have brain structures that look a lot more like, in these MRIs, look a lot more like straight women, and lesbian women's brains look a lot more like straight men's brains. And so that's something that suggests at least some kind of correlation, something is happening in the brain. That's part of that sex of the brain thing that we were talking about earlier on. There also is a fraternal birth order effect and the maternal immune hypothesis. And I give the last part of it here, but there is about a 3 times greater chance for, this is what we used to say, it's nuanced a bit now. If you have 1 son versus having 2 or 3 or 4 sons, that by the time you get to the 4th son, you have about a 3 times greater chance of that boy being gay, according to most studies that have been done. About 3 times more. And part of it is that women's bodies, as they birth children, remember the boy bodies who've come before. This is true for boys, but not for girls. They remember them, and they produce antibodies increasingly with each successive boy. And so those antibodies do some transformation of sexual orientation and sexual differentiation in utero. So that's interesting. And what's been more recently suggested is that this is true only for right-handed boys, or boys who are right-handed, and it's reversed for left-handed boys. So I don't know what all that means, but anyway. Also, we know that a man is more likely to be gay if there are gay men on his mother's side of the family. Lesbians' inner ears tend to be able to hear differently than straight women's ears. In general, gay men have more testosterone, larger genitalia than straight men. Lesbians' ring fingers, you can see, there's just a whole bunch of things. There are a number of things here that you can that are suggestive of some kind of biological connection, that there is something that's written into us, woven into us, that sort of points toward some kind of biological basis for our sexual orientation. So anyway, there's at least a biological or genetic flavoring. Most people who study sex, most biologists, most scientists would say that there is a biological or genetic flavoring of sexual orientation. There's a flavoring of it. It's not 100% heritable. It doesn't mean if you have these factors, you will be gay, or you will be straight, or you will be bisexual. It could mean that at least, but there is a kind of pointing in that direction. And the cause of sexual orientation may be different from person to person. It may be different combinations of some of these biological factors. It may be those things along with some social construction that's happened in the household, dynamics of the relationships in the families and with older siblings, and bad experiences and good experiences in life. There are a number of things that can contribute to all of that. So it's not nature entirely, it's not nurture entirely, it's some combination of these that likely leads to same-sex orientation, as well as heterosexual orientation, as well as the various kinds of orientations that come in between that. Each person may come to their sexual orientation through a different pathway. The sex textbook that we use for the human sexuality class right now says it's possible that 50 to 70% of sexual orientation is genetically or biologically influenced, but its expressions and choices could, for human beings make, could be attributable to social and cultural influences, not just that. So that's the main thing I wanted to say. I can say more things too, but I would rather hear feedback and questions from you that would push back or ask me to say more about something or whatever else you'd like to say. Yeah.
I'm curious about your MRI of the brains. The red section, what is shown in red?
I wish I knew. I'm not sure what that one actually shows. It's showing the hemispheres and sort of the mapping out of them, but I don't know exactly what they're showing in those. But we're supposed to be able to see the combination of similarities, yeah, between them.
I suspect those are some type of what they call functional MRI, where
Stimuli.
looking at pictures, and then they record different things. And they
Could be.
find different areas.
Yeah.
That's what I suspect.
Yeah.
Is there more homosexuality now? I have two questions.
Yeah.
And we're learning more about genetic mutations. Is there any correlation between those two questions? Could you repeat the question?
The question was, is there more homosexuality now than there used to be? And do we are learning about genetic mutations, and is there any correlation between thinking about genetic mutations and about more homosexuality or less homosexuality? I would say in terms of people practicing same-sex sexuality and admitting it, and people who identify as being same-sex oriented or of some other than some sexually marginal orientation, those numbers have definitely gone up. I don't know that that means that there are more gay people than there ever were, but certainly people who are willing to identify and say that they are gay, and to a certain extent, people who are willing to practice same-sex practices and acknowledge that they are doing same-sex practices. But this has been true for a long, long time, so it's really hard to know, because culturally, once it's more acceptable to be able to say, yes, I practice some kind of same-sex sexual behavior, people will say that more than they used to be. So is there more? It seems like maybe there's more. Maybe culturally people have felt a little bit freer to practice. I don't know whether genetic mutation has anything to do with that or not. I suspect not. I mean, I don't think for genetic mutation, it would take eons, centuries, for there to be some kind of transformation or shift that would happen. And I don't know what would be creating any kind of genetic mutation that would relate to this issue at all at this stage in history. I'd be surprised. Yeah, there are lots of people in lots of subcultures who practice, or other cultures who practice same-sex sexual behaviors but don't consider them gay behaviors. So if you do, for instance, a survey in Mexico or among a number of Latino populations and say, have you ever had a same-sex sexual encounter? Most men would say, no, they haven't. Even if they have anally or orally penetrated another man. Because it's not understood in Latino cultures, especially in Mexican culture, it's not understood that if you are the penetrator, that you have engaged in a homosexual behavior. That's still a heterosexual act because you're the penetrator. And so it's only the person who has received a penis, anally or orally, a male, who would identify himself as having engaged in a same-sex sexual practice. So there's some interesting dynamics like that culturally that shape what people say about their behaviors. Yeah.
Keith, one observation I would say to tie in with Sarah's comment is just when you think about 50 or 60 years ago that it was illegal
Sure.
to do those things,
Yeah.
then it was I'm sure much less divulged.
Yeah.
Versus when it's no longer illegal but maybe not favored.
Right.
So,
It's only been about 30 years, 25 years that it's been legal, maybe since about 1996, that's been legal in all 50 states to engage in same-sex behaviors. Many states still had laws in the books. At least 12 states still had laws in the books until about 1996 that said you couldn't practice any kind of same-sex sexual behavior. So that's really recent. Yeah.
I'd like to comment on the genetic factor.
Yeah.
At one point you said there's probably not a gay gene,
Yeah.
and one of your slides talked about multiple genes. Most of our traits and characteristics we have as humans are the expression of multiple genes.
Uh-huh.
For example, at birth, we may have a string bean body or a pear-shaped body, but then as we mature, our interaction with culture changes that.
Uh-huh.
I think the same thing is going on in orientation.
That fits with what most scientists are saying now. Yeah. But you might have a genetic predisposition to get really heavy or to stay really thin. So depending on how you eat and whether you exercise, you might be more likely to stay in that direction or not. That's sort of where you have a trajectory that you're on. Yeah. And for some people, that trajectory is extraordinarily difficult. If you have, it's extraordinarily difficult to alter that, even if you're talking about weight. Was there a question over here somewhere? Yeah, John.
I was just gonna make an observation.
wondered
Yeah.
what you think about this. It seems like that in our congregations in the last 50 years, it was very acceptable for two women to live together,
Yes,
but not for two men.
yes,
And we just accepted that in our congregation
yes,
and never said much about it.
yes.
In fact, George Brunk had a special trailer that went to his evangelistic meetings that always had two women in it.
Yeah. There's a book titled, I think the title is Homosexuality, or it's called something like Lesbianism Before Homosexuality. And it talks about what used to be called Boston marriages, especially women who lived together, probably slept in the same bed, probably had some level of at least of physical touch and some kind of intimacy, physical intimacy, but who were not considered lesbian because we just didn't do that. And we didn't ask many questions about it. It was more acceptable for women than it was for men. And that has something to do with how we perceive sort of the dynamics of a heterosexual sexual encounter and what's necessary to actually have sex. Yeah, I've often said, but yeah, I've often said that based on how most people, even most of my college students, define what means to be having sex, having a penis and a vagina, all gay and lesbian people are permanently celibate, and they can also claim that sort of title if they want to say, yes, they are celibate because there's no penis and vagina together. And that's the way we typically think about that. So if there's no penis present, we don't think about that being sexual in some ways. That's part of, I think it's part of what's going on for that sociologically. Yeah.
Larry Yoder and I lived together 53 years ago. And we were told that we might want to get married because people were starting to worry about us. So I married Carolyn and Larry married Jan.
Case settled. So, yeah. Yeah.
I think the church should accept people as being gay. Maybe the families wouldn't have to deal with what I and my family dealt with. You know, we were married, and when we had our third child, well, we had 4 children by that time, is when I found out he was gay.
Okay.
And I thought since if he had been accepted.
Yeah. Yeah. There were people who did what you did. They married someone, but because they felt like they had to protect themselves because it wasn't allowable. And then they find themselves in situations like you're describing. Cliff Carnegie, back since the 1980s or early 90s, used to go around at Mennonite conferences, the biennial conference, and hand out little cards that had his name and address and everything on it and said, "Help me save your heterosexual children from my children." So in other words, something like that. I don't remember the exact language of it, but the idea was that don't make your, let me think about this. The idea was don't make my gay children marry somebody because they think they have to. Marry someone of the other sex. And so it was a kind of a whimsical way of sort of standing on its head how people thought about that. It made you think when you received this card and had to reflect on it. Yeah.
Well, I've often said, I wish people could just admit what they are. We wouldn't have gotten married.
Yeah.
And Dan said that when we had went for counseling. He said, well, as a teenager, he realized, he had the feeling when the other guys talked about their relationship to women,
Uh-huh.
he didn't feel that way, but, well, how do you know?
Yeah.
You know, what he thought he was probably normal.
Yeah. There is likely, I mean, we go back to Kinsey's continuum. I don't know where he would be on Kinsey's continuum, but there is some level of fluidity, and there are people, like my student who is bisexual, who I think is going to be able to pull off a good monogamous heterosexual marriage, but it requires honesty from both partners about sort of what the realities are. When I talk with my students, when I talk with people I do premarital counseling with, I should say, I'm doing premarital counseling, one of my standard questions, I've had 2 couples I've married over the years where one of them came out later on and then they were divorced. I'm trying to think now. In one case, they stayed married. In the other case, they were divorced. But I always ask students now who are getting married, have you ever had any kind of same-sex sexual attraction or practice in any way? And have you talked with each other about that if that's the case? So it doesn't determine what your future is necessarily, but you have to be open about what that is and go into the marriage with your eyes open to know what's happening. Again, it depends on where you are on a continuum. And for some people, over the course of a lifetime, as hormones change, as opportunities change, people are saying, and it's controversial, that there's more fluidity in this than we think, and that may make you nervous, but there's more fluidity in sexual orientation than we used to think. So you might shift from being more heterosexually oriented, somewhere down here like a 3 or 2.5 on Kinsey's continuum, and shift over to a 3.5 or 4 at some point, or vice versa. And so that kind of fluidity can happen to a certain extent. So it doesn't mean that sexual orientation is changeable. If you're at 6 or you're at 0, you're going to stay there. But if you're somewhere sort of in that margin in the middle, you have more flexibility and more choices, certainly. And that makes people nervous, I know. Yeah, John?
Over the last 20, 25 years, there's been a real burgeoning of the creationist mentality among many conservative Christians. Does that correlate at all with and presumably many of them would also be conservative on this issue. Does this issue correlate with any kind of anti-science mentality itself? Have you noticed that over the years?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it in the way that you're asking it. I mean, if you look back at creation and you believe the sort of 6 days of creation as they are in the biblical texts, and so it's the whole God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Although Steve has a lot of orifices that make for other possibilities too. So there is that kind of reality in the way that our bodies are created.
I wasn't really thinking about that.
You weren't thinking about that. You were just thinking about in terms of rejection of science, rejection of science, so the rejection of science of this. So it might affect whether or not they care about sexual orientation. But we are in this alternative fact reality that we're in. We're in almost a post-truth society and almost a post-science society right now. And it can still go back, but right now we're in a very scary and dangerous point, I think. And so it may be that there's just a wholesale rejection of what this stuff suggests about orientation. That's also all biased. The scientists who are doing it are also biased, people might say, and so therefore we can't believe that they're only trying to prove their point.
You haven't really noticed that kind of thing coming from students or?
No, people under 30 don't care. I mean, it's a rare student who has any resistance when they come into, for instance, the human sexuality class or my religion and sexuality class. It is a rare student who has any kind of issues or problems with same-sex sexuality. That doesn't mean they are gay or lesbian, but they have friends who are. Their aunts and uncles have come out. Some of their parents have come out, or grandparents. And so for them, it really is not an issue. So they're not thinking out of that mode at all. I mean, at least the students that we see at Goshen College, which I think is pretty normal for this generation across the country. Yeah.
Are there differences or thought to be differences among races with regard to sexuality?
There are differences. There are some differences in terms of sexual practices between different races. Genetically, yeah, you'd have to be a little bit careful. There are some suggested differences in some kinds of behaviors. African American women tend to be more androgynous than white women do in terms of their behaviors, but that could all be socially constructed by being raised by single mothers, for instance. A greater preponderance raised by single mothers, and those are other dynamics. But in terms of genetic makeup that pushes people toward one orientation or the other, I don't think that would be the case. Yeah, there's not much literature on it anyway. So
I'm just going to say, if you have to leave, feel free to leave right now. So we'll let this be kind of a cutoff point. But Keith, if you're able to stay, I think we'd be happy to stay and continue this conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Are there any studies on education levels or income levels? In other words, poor versus rich, have we defined that, or?
There haven't been that I know of. There is on things like divorce and whether marriages last. Marriages of people who are educated and who are middle or upper class tend to last longer than those people who are less educated and of lower income class. But in terms of sexual orientation, I've never seen anything that made a correlation between those sorts of levels. You might, I mean, you could posit that it was a luxury of being middle and upper class, but I don't think it's necessary. I mean, same-sex orientation, for instance, or same-sex practice is a luxury of middle or upper class, but I don't think that's true at all. And I don't think it's been studied. Yeah.
What about Native American cultures that have this two-spirit?
Yeah, they're Native American, some Plains cultures have what's called the Two-Spirit or the Berdache. And the Berdache actually has more to do with trans sorts of realities than anything else. I talk about that in class when we look at sort of transgender, transsexual kinds of things. But in Native American Plains cultures, those who have this Berdache category, it's not male and not female, it's a gender in between, and it's in touch with both sort of the male spirits and female spirits, and elevated. So people who are trans in these Native American cultures are held up as being spiritual shamans. They're the ones who know, because they know both male and female experience. It's pretty different than what we have in the rest of U.S. culture. And there are other subcultures. In Puerto Rico, there's a what's it called? Huevaderos, something like that. It means penis at 12. There's a category that's another trans kind of category that's that in-between thing. So it's not necessarily intersexual. It has more to do with gender identification, on the gender identification spectrum. Other questions? When you hear what we've been talking about tonight, does it have any impact at all on how you think about your embrace of college church's statement? Can I ask this question, Phil? I don't know. Or can I ask this question? Does it have any impact at all on how you think about things, or is this not? You've already kind of made up your mind, and it doesn't matter.
You can ask the question, but doesn't mean people will answer.
Okay. It muddied the water? Yeah. How pure was the water before? Yeah, yeah.
Say, for me, it doesn't necessarily change how I was thinking, but I think we should go with it.
Uh-huh.
But for me, coming to these presentations is more about hearing kind of where everybody is.
Uh-huh.
I'm not looking to have my mind changed because I'm ready to move forward.
Yeah.
But just to kind of sort of hear what the temperament, I don't know what
Uh-huh.
for exactly
Yeah.
is of the congregation.
Yeah. Yeah. You're demographically overall, I don't know what is your median age at College Mennonite? It's maybe not 80, 78, you said. It's older. There are lots of younger people I see here too, here tonight, and so you do have that sort of reality. But you definitely, as a congregation, are making a decision. If you make the decision and embrace this statement, that will be counter to most people of that older generation, and so that would be actually a much more radical step than our congregation was at Assembly in doing what it did in the 90s. It would be more radical in some ways by having this generation of people making those decisions.
Phil, didn't you find out when you did the survey that the older generation was more, we did that study a couple years ago, and it was, you did the sojourners.
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah, I think that's right. In that process, it was not a scientific process, and people who filled out the forms were self-selecting, so I'm reluctant to make too much judgment of that, but in that particular sample, self-chosen sample, that was true.
It may be too that by that age in this congregation, enough people had recognized that they had gay and lesbian children and grandchildren, and that made some difference in how they perceived things, because that does tend to shift some of our thinking. And maybe the middle-aged people who had younger children didn't know yet. So, yeah.
I'm not saying anything that a lot of you aren't thinking for yourselves, but I've told friends over the years, you know, I went to Goshen College and I got my degree in education because women were either teachers or nurses, and I didn't want to be a nurse. And so I just did what was done. And now I think, oh, the kids with their options for careers, it's just all wide open, and I'm thinking that's not the only thing they're thinking about. Their whole sexual orientation is wide open, and how can we not love and accept every one of us? And for all the things we're going through and how complex life is,
Yeah.
it's just wonderful and truly baffling.
Yeah. I said a week and a half ago when I spoke to Sojourners, I was growing up, when most of you were growing up, things were much simpler and cleaner, even though we didn't think they were. They were simpler and cleaner and easier in some way. They were also more restrictive. We didn't have as many options. And now people have like all the options, and it makes it much more complex. It's much freer, but it's also much more complex to negotiate that territory. And I see that sort of trauma that some students experience because of that. I'm not just checking my text. I wanted to show you a couple of quotes from students here, if I can track these down. Let me see if I can find these. Is there another question while I'm looking for things here? Yeah, go ahead.
Question, but something I'd like this group to ask themselves. How many were born into the sex that you are? How many were born with the culture that you are in? And how many of you had been born homosexual? Think of it as it's something that you don't have control over, how you are born, or where you are born, and what you are born into. And then we turn right around and say you cannot love another individual. And God is love. What does that say?
Yeah. Let me read to you two statements from students that go back to this complexity question. I read these to the group a week or two ago, and this will also be scary. I thought after I did that presentation with the Sojourners, I could see some people's hair blowing back. I'm talking about this sort of shifting young adult sexual landscape. But these are comments from two students, and these were self-identifications. Remember I talked about how self-identity is sometimes difficult. One student said, "I identify as a demisexual, gender-fluid individual who consider themself as dominantly female." So I identify as a demisexual, gender-fluid individual who consider themselves as dominantly female. Another student said, "I would currently describe my orientation/identity as polysexual, polyamorous, gray, aromantic, bigender, transmasculine person." Now, he has a lot of difficulty negotiating that territory. So, still trying to figure out what that all means for his life. Yeah.
I'm not sure everyone at College Church understands exactly what we are going to be doing perhaps in March. Someone said to me yesterday, well, don't we accept people? But that person doesn't understand, I think, what we are really working at. I think that needs to be repeated.
Anne wants to say something about that, I think.
I had a question, I think earlier in this series, Becky, you made a strong point that we are not taking a position on this issue. And my question was, why not? We have a good statement, I think, that we will be acting on, but my original thought was, are we not at College Church coming to a point of identifying ourselves as an open, welcoming
was informed that, no, we're just moving in that direction. And then earlier in this series, the Wednesday nights, Becky made a very strong point of saying, we are not taking a position here. And my question is, why not? And I'd also be interested to know what the ramifications of your action at Assembly meant in the long-term after effects in your congregation.
Yeah, it's complicated. We were disciplined by the Indiana-Michigan Conference in 1999-ish, I believe. We voluntarily withdrew from being voting members of the conference for a few years. Our congregation took a sabbatical where we totally welcomed and opened people into the congregation who were gay, lesbian, or bisexual and in committed relationships, or even if they were in committed relationships. But during the sabbatical time, the church had decided it was not going to talk about gay and lesbian stuff anymore for that period of 7 years. That was enormously painful for our gay and lesbian people in the congregation, and a number of them left. And some people who couldn't believe that we weren't talking about it and condemning it left at the same time too. So after that, Assembly became completely open and welcoming, joined the welcoming networks of the church, and then our pastor, after telling conference he was going to do so, one of our pastors married a lesbian couple in the church who'd been a part of the church for a long time. He's done at least one other same-sex marriage since that time. And then we have this benefit, maybe, of having been long-term dually affiliated, Indiana-Michigan Conference and Central District Conference. And Central District rolls with it, and they very much embrace what our pastors have done and what we have done as a congregation. They are fully behind us and fully endorsing the moves that we've made as a congregation. Indiana-Michigan, not so much. And so for a period, I don't even know if the period is still going now, all of us at Assembly voluntarily pulled our credentials. I'm credentialed also. We pulled our credentials from Indiana-Michigan Mennonite Conference and had them held by the congregation and by Central District Conference. But we stayed in both conferences. Now, I don't remember, actually, if Indiana-Michigan still holds our credentials or not. But we have had a very rocky road with Indiana-Michigan Conference. We have wanted to stay in the game, partly because there are other congregations who also want to make a move like Assembly has done and would like other people alongside them who will be supportive of the move that they've made. What your congregation has in terms of Indiana-Michigan Conference is you have the power of people, the numbers, and money. Indiana-Michigan Conference, I think, would not survive if College Mennonite Church were not a part of it right now. There's so many congregations have been hacked away from it, have walked away from Indiana-Michigan Conference, that if College Church would pull out, I don't think the conference would last. So that puts you in a position of interesting kind of power in relation to the conference. I'm talking too much about this stuff. I probably shouldn't. I'm probably going beyond where I should be talking. Phil's going to stop me now.
Just in the interest of time, I think I'm going to cut this to a close. Thank you all for staying so late. I'd just like to say a few words about the focus on the word position, and why those of us who are working with this process find the word position problematic and want to focus instead on practices and behaviors. And the primary reason is that we are a diverse congregation, and our welcome statement that we have recognizes that we are a diverse congregation, and we want to be very careful not to trade one kind of exclusion for another. So that's so having a position and waving the bloody flag and saying, "Look at us, yay us, we've arrived," is not where those of us in leadership want to take College Mennonite Church. But we also see that we need to begin to change some practices at College Mennonite vis-a-vis some of these issues that probably a preponderance, a critical mass, we don't really know, but we're guessing, are ready to move to more open practices on these issues. What exactly I mean, that's going to be for us to decide as a congregation, and we have to work at that. But we want to be very careful not to look down our noses at people who feel differently than we do. And there's a real tendency when you take a position and say, this is what College Mennonite believes in. If you don't believe this, go find another church. I don't want to say that to anybody. And I think when I say that within the spirit of the best that is College Mennonite Church. We want to be a big tent. So when we're talking about positions, just that's our kind of discomfort with the word position. And it often positions don't end up meaning very much on the ground in terms of how we live our lives. And we really want to focus instead on practices and how we live and how we relate to each other and how we relate to people who are gay and lesbian, and think in those terms, because I think those are much more likely to impact how we live, rather than taking a position and feeling like our work is done. If we take a position, our work won't be done. And we might feel good about ourselves for a little bit, but our work would just be beginning. So that's a little bit about just some clarity about that. And I think some of us, the position and taking a position and feels like closure, maybe for some, and you're looking for closure. And I think it's a process, and I'm not sure that there's going to be closure. But there will be changes, probably, if you all decide, that's up to you. There'll be changes in practices. That's something and so that's a word that we're really emphasizing, is practices. Does that make sense? Does that provide some clarity around that? And when I say practices, I mean something like a pastor of College Mennonite Church performing a same-sex wedding. That would be a practice that might change at College Mennonite Church if we make that decision. That's, and maybe it's wordsmithing. Position, practice, but I think it's an important distinction. Thank you, Keith. George.
Don't we have a long-standing position?
A long-standing position.
A position for generations.
In terms of?
The way you're using position.
Do we have a position? I'm not sure that College Mennonite College Mennonite has practices, I would say. I don't think we put a whole lot of stock in positions at College Mennonite Church, as I've read as I read our historic documents.
Is there a place for publicly stating that we are, for any congregation, to say that we are an open, welcoming, supportive network congregation?
Well, I think right now we have the statement, and that speaks for itself. The statement speaks for itself. That would be a public statement. That would be a statement that would say, this is where we are at right now as a congregation at this point in our journey. We're talking about approving a statement, right?
I understand that, but there are many congregations, I think there are 700 or so, that have come out identifying themselves as a supportive network congregation. Should they not have done that?
Well, you're using. I'm not familiar with all that you're talking about. I know there's a supportive congregations network, which is, I don't know how many are in that. Now, it used to be like 20. And that's a very different kind of commitment than what we're talking about. You have to vote as a congregation to join that, and we're not proposing that we vote to join that. Well, I'm not going to tell other congregations what they should do. I have enough trouble trying to figure out what this one should do. Is there? I mean, I don't know. That's not for me to decide.
No, I think it would be helpful at this point if I would just read the proposed welcome statement.
Yeah, good call. Marilyn, why don't you come up and use the microphone so people can hear?
We believe that all individuals are created in God's image, and all people, regardless of age, gender, race, citizenship status, abilities, or sexual orientation, are welcome as full participants in the life of our congregation. So you can decide what full participation means, but I think full participation means full participation.
There's a, Carl, I'm going to call you. There's a question somebody said right here. Go ahead, Tilly.
I saw in Genesis 2:24 to 25, man leaves the father and mother and cleaves to his wife. It doesn't say you can cleave to a man, you can cleave to another woman. It said they cleaves to his wife.
Well, and I'm going to say that's a conversation to have with Lauren Johns on Sunday. I mean, that's where we're doing the biblical work. So I would save that question, Tilly, for Sunday. And that's where that conversation happened. Thank you. But I would encourage you to do that at that time. That when we're doing the biblical work. Carl.
Could you clarify what we are doing? Are we going to adopt that statement in March? I'm confused.
Right. We're voting on it. The plan is to vote in March on that statement. That's correct.
Now, how is that different from a position?
Well, it's a statement, and I think positions tend to be this defines College Mennonite as a welcome statement. There's more nuance there in that statement. I think there's some recognition of our diversity that's there for one, and I think that's really important to recognize our diversity. A statement tends to be, I think, more restrictive, more confining. I mean, a position tends to be more restrictive and more confining, and I don't want us to be restricted too much. I'd like us to be more open and have more freedom as a congregation. And there will be more time for conversations, and we have planned time for conversations, so that'll be more open-ended. This is very focused, and we've been fortunate that we have a little bit more time than we typically have this evening. So there will be more time for this conversation. So, Larry, that'll be the end.
I'm wondering whether this statement goes far enough, whether a married gay couple would feel invited or welcome in the congregation.
So, irregardless of what the statement says, you're wondering if a married couple would be welcome? Oh, if the statement communicates, well, one of the questions is, does the statement authentically communicate the reality of College Mennonite Church? So that's one question. So, for example, if a congregation votes 51 to 49 to be a welcoming congregation, is that congregation welcoming? Is somebody going to feel welcome here? So that's one question that I'm kind of hearing there. I don't know. I can't answer that question about that statement. That's a question for you all to discuss and think about together. So I called Larry the end because we are at 8 o'clock here. So Martin, save it. Hang on to that question. Hang on to it. Well, hang on to the comment because there'll be other opportunities. We have to. I know we all want to engage, and that's really good. So that's really good that you all have questions and comments, but we have to bring things to a close sometime, and an hour and a half probably is maybe a good time. So thank you all for coming. Let's give Keith a round of applause. Thank you, Keith.